All right, and we're live. Good morning, everyone. Good day, everyone. Hopefully, everyone's having a great start to their Monday. Vee will be joining us here shortly, but I'm very excited today to be hosting with our guest his show, The Sirius Report with London Paul. If we host a weekly show with Paul. Always very excited for Mondays to get his intelligence report in regards to lots of things going on geopolitically. So let's we always run short of time, it seems like, Paul. So let's jump right into it. How are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well, in yourself. And good morning and afternoon and evening to whoever's listening, wherever in the world.
Yeah, so very exciting times, and I know last week we had some topics that we didn't get to, but I want to just kind of open the floor to you to kick off and just jump into whatever is currently on your radar, Paul.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll talk about Catalonia in some detail, but I mentioned in the chat room on the morning show something that's worth mentioning in the context of all the Russian kind of images they've released regarding US presence and working in cooperation with ISIS, or as you call it, USIS, which I think is a very apt term to apply to them. But what I can say is, and this is far more damning than producing images, is that the Russians over the last couple of years have captured a number of US special forces working with said ISIS, and they have them in captivity. So it would be pretty damning evidence if they were to produce mugshots of these people and say, by the way, we captured these operatives working with ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, in the field. Because the reality is they're not going to capture them where the Americans are operational, because they just couldn't get into those environments and arrest US forces working in US held areas with the US. It's pretty obvious if they've got these people, they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. And that's why I've said in the article over the weekend, it's very likely you'll see this escalation, and there's further evidence coming out all the time. And I think the Russians will go kind of hell for leather now to put the information out, just to put a stamp on proceedings. And they're simply doing it because they're literally now in kind of direct armed combat with the US. Because since they've crossed the Euphrates, obviously the whole Azor region, they're now actually almost in open warfare with the US and vice versa. And we've seen, you highlighted the 29 Russian soldiers who were captured, and they thought it was some great coup. And of course, it all blew up in their face. And I won't reiterate everything V said, but this is just an escalation, because now we're reaching the tipping point where in that region, if the Syrians and the Hezbollah and everyone else who's fighting on that side make further advancements, they'll start to gain control of all the oil fields. Well, not only will that put Daesh out of operation, it will also make the whole future issue of controlling these zones superfluous to the Americans, because that's their bargaining chip, is the economic value in this. That's why they want to retain these areas. And they're simply, fighting a losing battle in that regard. And that's why we're seeing these tempers frayed, and why the Russians have now come out and started to release these images. But as I say, if they release images of US Special Forces operative, I mean, that's going to be sort of the icing on the cake of what we've seen currently.
Correct. I mean, and the Russians really have no choice at this point. I mean, I think that they have been, more than patient for the last several months, Paul. And now you see the continued effort to push new sanctions to also get the here domestically in the United States, get the United States, the media, the social media to start banning some of these Russian news outlets, because I think here in the U.S. they're anticipating more of evidence coming out regarding the United States involvement in Syria.
Oh, undoubtedly, yeah. That's the big fear and the big risk. And of course, they can keep denying it, but eventually, at some point, people are going to start going, "Hang on, we keep hearing this. We're seeing evidence. It can't all be doctored. It can't be all fictitious. It can't be all lies." And that's what they're terrified of, is that public opinion in the US starts to turn, and people realize that Russia isn't the nation they're portrayed to be. They're not the boogeyman. They're not the big bag ogre who's going around the world committing atrocities on behalf of Assad and everyone else in the process. So, yeah, undoubtedly that is what's factored into the thinking. But it's just a further indication of their desperation as the war in Syria starts to not exactly draw to a conclusion. But I mean, compared to what it was 6 months ago, they've made major advancements in terms of Aleppo, and obviously now Deir ez-Zor. And very soon, in reality, Daesh will be crushed in Syria, and then effectively the war's over, and the US, and not the US military, but the US kind of intelligence agency, the special force, all the ones who were in there in the first place to undermine and overthrow Assad, will have lost. Their war's over and it's finished, and they're desperate for that not to happen. But in the process, Russia will play fire with fire, not just on the battlefield, but also in terms of the intelligence that they've gathered, and they have huge amounts of it. And we spoke about this probably on one of the first shows we did way back in January, that Russia possesses a lot of intelligence and information, and when the time's right, they will leak it to the world. But more so, they're likely to do it when they've just reached the end of their tether with the US, because there has been huge amounts of cooperation and back channeling with them, and there has been a lot of success in that regard. But when that incident happened with the 29 Russian servicemen, that's just enough is enough. They're not going to tolerate that. And of course, the fight back and the response was astronomical in terms of killing 850 Daesh operatives and destroying all the infrastructure and hardware in the process. That was just a gentle reminder to Washington: don't mess with us, because we've just had enough of it. And if you're going to carry on doing this, in the end, the risk is that US operatives will be killed by Russian operatives in the battlefield. That is a big problem and a big risk, and we're increasingly getting to that point that may just happen. But if I can guarantee, if these special forces operatives do undertake these kind of activities, which we know are designed to protect Daesh, then if they're in the line of fire in that process, they will be taken out. The days of saying to Washington, clear the area because we don't want to kill any of your operatives, are over. Those the sort of Moscow Mr. Nice Guys going very rapidly.
And I think what you said, Paul, is just so important, because that is the reality that we're facing now in Syria, is that U.S. special forces and Russian forces are pretty much going to be on a collision course here. It's already happened. It's already started. And once that moment happens, where potentially American forces are being killed by Russians, what happens then?
Well, yeah, but to put it in context, I mean, we've already had insane situations where American forces have been killing American operatives. Also, that's happened in Syria over the last couple of years, not extensively, but at times, because that's how the fog of war is in Syria. It's very difficult at times to know who's on whose side, and there are certainly US operatives who've been buried deep inside Daesh, and at times they have been killed by the Americans on occasions when operations against Daesh have actually happened, although it's sadly been largely a rarity. But there have been occasions when missions have been undertaken, and as a result of it, paradoxically, Americans have been killing Americans. But that was always the risk. But it certainly is very different if Americans start killing Russians. And there's no doubt, from Moscow's perspective, when these 29 Russian servicemen were detained, and that they believed there was American involvement in it, and therefore that is crossing the red line, and they will take action as a result of it. And there's no doubt the timing is everything, and we always say this, and that's why the images started to come out, because they want the world to see the reality. Now, Western nations are less likely to be taken on board and accept it, but it cements a lot of feelings in other parts of the world, and gradually, bit by bit, the tide will turn in nations like the US, the UK, and Europe. And they'll start to realize the reality of what's going on, and that part of the big educational re-education process for people in the West, to realize precisely what our nations have been doing on our behalf and should never have been allowed to do it. And this is nothing to do with British people or American people. And it's not even largely to do with the military. It's to do with covert forces or special ops, or the US intelligence agency, UK intelligence agencies meddling in nations and carrying out these actions. And half the time it's not on behalf of the US or the UK military, who often have a very different perspective. And there is a lot of internal wrangling going on in that regard between all these agencies and the regular forces, because precisely of the actions they're undertaking.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It'd be interesting to continue monitoring it and see the reaction, the things that happen here in the U.S. But Paul, also very interested to get your insights in regards to Catalonia and the independence movement there, something that's not getting a whole lot of coverage here in the U.S. Could you share with us your information regarding Catalonia, please?
Yeah, we can go through kind of chronology of events. Try to do it kind of. There's a lot happened, so we'll try and be fairly brief. But the historical perspective with Catalonia is it's sought to have independence from Spain for years, and back in nearly 3 years ago, they had 80% of Catalans took part in this non-binding referendum on their status as part of Spain, and they voted in favour of Catalonia becoming an independent state. But of course, the independence vote was ruled unconstitutional by Madrid. But what it did in essence is give a flavour of how people in Catalan don't want to be part of Spain anymore. So what happened is on the 6th of September, Madrid was spitting feathers about it, but the Catalan Parliament passed a law to hold an independence referendum on the 1st of October. And the simple question is, from the Catalonians' perspective, whether or not they want the Spanish province to become an independent country in the form of a republic. And pretty quickly, there was a reaction to this from Madrid. And on the 7th of September, Spain's Prosecutor General said they were preparing a lawsuit against a number of Catalan lawmakers and government officials for passing this law and holding an independence referendum on the 1st of October. Now, it seems incredulous, but that's basically the way Europe works now. Anyone who wants to have a referendums, I mean, we saw it in Holland, we've seen it countless times where in Ireland where they refused the Lisbon Treaty and they kept making them vote until they passed it. So this was indicative of Madrid themselves trying to stick a spanner in the works. But on the same day, on the 7th, the president of the European Parliament, who's Antonio Tajani, basically said that he's publicly stated that the constitutional framework of a member state is part of the legal framework of the European Union. Incredible to think you're supposed to be a sovereign nation, but your constitutional framework of you as a nation such as Spain is part of the legal framework of the European Union. Well, we know it's true, but enforcing it is an entirely different matter. And he's basically saying, so therefore any action against the constitution of a member state is an action against European Union's legal framework, hence it's not valid. So then on September the 11th, there was about 400,000 people marched in Barcelona. This was Catalonia's national day. And they were in support of, obviously, the Catalan independence. And then the following day, on the 12th, the Constitutional Court of Spain applied for a review of the lawsuit of the country's government, and that was against the Catalan law on the transition to independence. And then the following day, on the 13th, the Spanish Prosecutor General's office summoned the mayors of towns in Catalonia to ask them to clarify their position on this independence referendum. Now, they were summoned, and basically what they were told is that, if they were to proceed with this referendum, it would be illegal and there could be serious consequences for them to do so. Now, what the basis of this was that 700 of these mayors marched in Catalonia demanding that the referendum takes place. So the Spanish prosecutor went, we're not having that. And we're going to call some of these people in and ruffle them up a bit and try to frighten them. And on the 14th of September, the official website of the Catalan government, which obviously was covering the referendum for their independence, it was blocked by a court order. Basically, the officials of the Spanish Guardia Civil entered the offices where this website was hosted and delivered the court order. And of course, the website was shut down. I mean, this is incredulous that this is all happening in the space of about a week. Now, what's interesting, when you got to the 16th of September, there was people starting to say, hang on a minute, what is the reality of this? Why is Spain getting so bent out of shape? And really, it's more of an economic reason, which rather than Catalonia secession from Spain. And because if you look at it, Catalonia accounts for about 1/5 of Spain's GDP. So it's nothing to be sniffed at. Now, interestingly, Juncker on the same day stated that the bloc will respect the choice of the Catalan people. So he's kind of contradicting other elements within the European Commission. But he's basically said, if Catalonia gets its independence, it can't become an EU member state immediately. It has to follow the same process that all the other EU nations who joined since 2004. And then it starts to get even more ugly because on the 17th of September, all these armed police turned up in Spain hunting for voting papers, ballot boxes, and leaflets to be used in this independence referendum. They raided print works and newspaper offices. I mean, it's just absolutely
Wow.
astonishing
Wow.
what's going on. And then Madrid passed measures to increase control over Catalonia's spending. So really what they're basically doing, they're trying to put a squeeze on them to prevent them from carrying out by saying, look, if you carry out this referendum, we're going to put a squeeze on your spending. And that was to prevent, obviously, this independence vote happening. And they carried on and questioned, in the end, over 700 Catalan mayors over their support for the referendum, and basically said, if you proceed with this, we'll withhold you from office, or we may actually even send you to prison for supporting the referendum. I mean, talk about the threats that were coming out. And then, of course, shortly afterwards, the Spanish economic minister starts coming out with all the scare tactics. Catalonia's GDP will fall anywhere between about 25 and 30%. Unemployment's going to go double. And it's because Catalonia will lose access to the EU single market, as well as trade barriers with Spain. So immediately Spain's threatening them, if you leave, will impose trade barriers on you and will cripple you as an independent nation. I mean, and these are actual public threats. They're not private. This is publicly being stated. And then
Correct.
individual mayors have come out and said that the Madrid authorities threatened to arrest them if they took part in it. And this is absolutely probably the icing on the cake. There was talk that Madrid would cut the electricity supplies to Catalonia on the day of the referendum to prevent it even happening.
Wow.
I mean,
Wow.
it's absolutely astonishing kind of behaviour. And then, of course, the Catalan presidents accused Madrid of attempting to block the referendum because they carried out all these search and arrests. And in essence, what they were doing, Madrid, was having a suspension of the regional self-governance with its actions to impede, obviously, the Catalan independence referendum. And then, of course, the Spanish prime minister weighs in and states that the referendum on independence is not going to happen and they should give up this dream. But then it gets kind of interesting because they came out with this comment. Then the following day, which was on the 22nd of September, just 3 days ago, the Spanish government suddenly turns all conciliatory and says, we're quite happy to have talks with the Catalonian authorities on reforming the funding system for the region, provided they abandon plans to gain independence. So one minute they're threatening to cut them financially, then they're talking about offering them sweeteners to stay in Spain by maybe changing how much money is given to them and the whole kind of taxation policy, etc. So that was kind of interesting. But then we saw another development because remember back in August in Barcelona we had the terrorist attack,
Right.
and
Correct. Yes.
suddenly the Spanish civil guard just suddenly detains this person in Castile who was suspected of ties to a terror cell that committed obviously the attack in Catalonia, i.e. Barcelona. And they said this was a Moroccan person residing in Spain. And it's almost like suddenly they're trying to tell the Catalonian people, look, we've saved you, we found this person. The people in Catalonia couldn't prevent this. And look, so it's almost like trying to induce them to say it's better to stay within the umbrella of Spain. Timing, once again, is everything. And then, of course, what's interesting is that the Catalan police then refuted the claims that the CIA had warned them about a terror attack being prepared. Now, once again, timing is everything, and it's almost as though it's trying to infer that the Catalan police knew this was happening, didn't tell you, and we, the Spanish, regular police, I've sorted this problem out, and it's almost discrediting the Catalan police in the process. Now, of course, the US intelligence agencies have denied this and said it's absolute nonsense. And I tend to actually believe it. I think this is just more ways of trying to smear Catalan in the process, not just in terms of, in a sense, questioning the operations of their own police, but also in a wider context in Spain, trying to discredit the Catalan police and authorities and making Spain look like they're in charge and they're dealing with things. Now we come to yesterday, and basically the Catalan authorities have refused to acknowledge that Madrid's trying to impose this single law enforcement coordinator. I mean, so basically, on with the view of ceasing this referendum being allowed to happen. And the Catalonian chief prosecutor informed the heads of the Catalan division of the Civil Guard and the National Police and the head of the Catalan police that they were supposed to, of this day, come under the management of Madrid and to report to this Colonel Diego Perez de los Cobos of the Spanish Civil Guard. Now, and what this de los Cobos was intending to do is hold meetings to plan and coordinate the action of law enforcement agencies inside Catalan. So effectively, the Spanish authorities were putting someone in to not only derail the entire referendum process, but effectively to take control of the civil guard, the national police, and the Catalan police with respect to Catalonia. Now, of course, the Catalonian authorities and their Ministry of Home Affairs said they don't agree with this and they're refusing to abide by it and accusing Madrid of interfering in the works of police units in Catalonia. So that's kind of a very brief, well, sort of fairly brief history, but it's worth putting it in because then people get an idea of what's actually been going on. So the question is, what happens in the future? Well, how strongly does Madrid react to the vote, and what future in Europe could be waiting for Catalonia if it cedes? Well, if the government gives the go-ahead for the referendum, or is it going to try and prevent the event? Well, it's debatable. It's hanging in. It's a melting pot. I suspect the referendum will go ahead, but they've gone to extraordinary measures to prevent it. Now, what the Catalonians have said is if the referendum occurs and the people vote yes, then they will declare Catalonia's independence by probably as early as the 4th of October. Now, we know the Spanish government's resorting to these sort of repressive methods.
Right.
Now, if the voters say no to Catalonia's independence, it'll mean the formation of a new self-governing bodies there because they've been pushing very hard for this independence referendum, and if it fails, then yes, they're going to need new self-governing bodies. However, if the voters say yes, then there's the issue to what extent the government of Catalonia can count on any support from other countries. Because it's one thing then saying, well, because an independent Catalonia would initially have to deal with other nations finding itself outside the EU. So then there is a question that Catalonia actually wants to be part of the EU. Now, let's not worry too much about that because the European Union is not going to exist as it does now. But that's their mentality and reasoning. Now, what's the possibility of holding negotiations on Catalonia rejoining the EU? Which, I mean, because the problem you have is no doubt Spain would attempt to block Catalonia's efforts to re-enter the EU. And if the vote goes out and they lose, they're going to do everything they can to make life hell for Catalonia in the process. And then the major problem is, will other countries recognise Catalonia as a sovereign state? I mean,
right.
and that's the risk. There might be a lot of pressure put on by Spain and the European Union to say, don't recognise Catalonia as a sovereign state. But the problem is, the economic reality is Madrid won't be able to withstand the shock of losing nearly a fifth of its GDP if Catalonia leaves. There is no doubt. And if we look at Spain's economy in a little bit of detail, you'll see the reason why. I mean, there was this bluster lately where Spain's economy grew by about 0.9% in the second quarter of 2017, going, and this growth figure suggests the country's economy's finally grown back to the size it was before the 2008 financial crisis. Now, also bear in mind, Spain was bailed out in 2012 by the EU when we had the height of Europe's debt crisis. But here's some figures which completely trashes this whole belief that Spain's economy is recovering. I mean, the official debt, they say, is 1.1 trillion euros, but the actual debt's much higher. I mean, the last figure given, ironically, by the Bank of Spain is that it was 1.6 trillion. And that's public debt generated from central government, local government, social security. And really, in the space of about 25 years, Spain dropped from being 9th to the 14th largest economy in the world. The average Spanish family debt now is about 140,000 euros. The debt to GDP is around 101%. And if they've really got it under control, the national public debt increased by another 10 billion euros in the second quarter of 2017. They're saying unemployment's about 17.5% and was 25%. I very much doubt that. I would suggest unemployment's probably at least 25% now. And when it was 25%, it's probably even higher. But these are not great figures. And the idea that Spain is economically rebounding is nonsense. And I think this is ultimately what is really worrying Madrid, is that if Catalonia leaves and takes a fifth of Spain's GDP with it, that's going to cripple. And that's going to be the thing that tips Spain into the abyss economically. Because I think if it was a region in Spain that wasn't economically significant, they wouldn't really care about it, because actually if it was economically weak, they go, well, that's one less region of Spain we have to worry about. It's like it's not an economic millstone around our neck, but in the case of Catalonia, it's an economic at least strong area, which would significantly weaken Spain if they leave. So I think ultimately that's what this is about at the moment. It's in the melting pot, but likely the referendum will happen, but it's not absolutely certain. But the backlash and the ramifications for not allowing it could be quite severe, because I think, once again, people in Spain would say, hang on, we might not agree with the Catalonians, but if you don't give them their right to have this vote, it may start to raise further questions and destabilize the Spanish government further. But we talked very briefly the measures they've undertaken in Madrid, and it's absolutely astonishing that they would do this to a nation simply on the basis that they want to cede away from Spain. And Catalonians don't believe they're Spanish. I mean, from my perspective, the city of Barcelona is one of my favorite cities in the world. I've been there a number of times. I like the whole region. I like the area. But the one impression I always got from there is that most of the people don't regard themselves as Spanish and would wish to cede and form their own independent republic. And that's been a long held desire for Catalonian people for many years.
Yeah, very interesting to watch this unfold. And here in the U.S., obviously, President Trump has been a very much supporter of nationalist movements. He was a supporter of Brexit, and now he's going to be faced here pretty soon. I believe Spain's president is set to meet with Trump on Tuesday. They're trying to garner support from the administration to oppose the referendum.
Oh yeah, undoubtedly they want to throw everything they can at it to try. I don't know who they're trying to convince in the process not to, because the Catalonians they're not going to convince in any way, shape, or form. But I think they're just trying to, in a way, convince the rest of Spain, this is not an appropriate move. But I mean, frankly, I don't think the Spanish are that interested in what Trump has to say. So it's probably completely irrelevant. But it shows the level of desperation because, of course, the other thing it does, it sets a precedent. Because if Catalonia succeeds in achieving independence, how many other regions and areas and across not just Spain? You've got the Basque region, for example, that might want to sue for independence, but also across Europe. We're going to see other areas will say, and regions will say, we want independence, we want autonomy. And it's kind of the thin end of the wedge, and that is also probably in a broader context what terrifies the European Union. Not that in a context it matters, because the European Union as it exists now is over and finished, but we're back to this point. These people just will simply not accept reality. Economic, geopolitical, and realities. They just continue to bury their head and believe that the European Union's turned the corner. I mean, Juncker's speech was just incredible, where he basically just said, oh, well, there's no problems, we've turned the corner and Europe's fine and strong, and talks about expanding the union. I mean, and they genuinely believe this. They just can't accept the reality of what's happening. So, yeah, in a broader context, it probably doesn't matter to some extent, but in the here and now, it very much does matter, and they are fighting tooth and nail because they realise that Catalonia leaves there. The risk is countless other regions will want to form their own republics, and ultimately, of course, the whole map of Europe is going to probably change to a large extent anyway, as we've discussed before. But this is a kind of microcosm of a much bigger problem. They're terrified that will grow out of control and spiral, and therefore they have to put a stamp on it. And in the process, of course, I mean, to go to the US and try and get Trump's support and throw the big nationalistic banner is not going to work, because Catalan, as we said, don't think they're Spanish, and they're very nationalistic in their own way in terms of Catalonia. So I'm not sure what they think it's going to achieve, but it's just purely desperation, really.
Right, right. And Merkel wins fourth term. Paul, what say you?
Well, yeah, of course, Merkel winning it on face value, it's like fourth term. She's going to be in office for 16 years, but it's worth breaking down what actually happened in terms of the vote. Now, the CDU and the CSU have had their worst election results since 1949. They lost effectively 8% in terms of the exit polls. The SPD, which is Schultz's party, lost about 5%. And the biggest winner was the AFD party. Now, we'll come into some detail about that. What's interesting with the AFD party is that if you break down Germany into what was West Germany and the old East Germany, um, it's interestingly that the vote for the AFD in East Germany, as it was nearly 25%. I mean, this is pretty huge. So, and what can we say about the AFD party? Well, the reality is they called this. They say there's all this idea that this radical right alternative for Germany party, but it enters the Bundestag because it got 13.3%, which was an increase of 8.8% from the last election. Now, the interesting thing is that the AFD got more votes from past non-voters, which was over 1 million, than the CDU, the CSU, which is Merkel's party, lost, which was 1 million, or the SPD, which lost 500,000. So in many ways, this was an anti-Merkel vote. And this was reflecting in opposition to a controversial, well, it's called Willkommenspolitik policy, which is to do with refugees. So it pushed some voters of mainstream parties to switch, but also obviously mobilized these non-voters. And the same polls also show that the vast majority of, like 90% of AFD voters thought Merkel's immigration policies are totally incorrect. 85% so want stronger national borders. And a great proportion think that 12 years of Merkel's more than enough. Well, frankly, I think 12 months of Merkel's more than enough, but that's just my opinion. But so they profited from the fact that immigration became a number one issue in the elections. Now, this party, it's whether you approve of them or not, it's a pretty extraordinary achievement for a party only formed 4 years ago. But it's seen as kind of a hugely controversial achievement because only last week, this Sigmar Gabriel, who's Germany's foreign minister, stated that voting for the AFD will be putting the Nazis back in the Reichstag. Now, that is pretty volatile comments. To make any reference to that is quite unbelievable. I mean, it may sound not as seismic to non-German people or to Americans or British people, but making reference to that and putting them in that context is pretty heated rhetoric. Now, the problem with the AFD is it was predominantly originally this Eurosceptic party, and it shifted its focus onto this anti-immigration, anti-Islam stance. And it's almost already we're seeing that the party's deeply fragmented. They're supposed to get about 90 seats in the Reichstag, but they're already kind of split within their own ranks. But their radical policies have resonated with German voters. That's for sure. So in a context, it was not a crushing defeat for Merkel, but very much a bloody nose for Merkel, and a clear indication that having 33% of the vote is hardly a ringing endorsement. But the way the political structure is, barring some unbelievable outcome, Merkel's going to be Germany's leader, well, until 2021, probably. We'll see what happens with the European Union and how whether she survives that long or not. But she is significantly weakened by this election. There's absolutely no doubt. They're expected to poll far better and maybe get 41, 42% of the vote. So a monopoly on power has been dented, and votes have turned further to the right and to the left, so the more kind of rather than the centre ground. But the question is now, what's the future? So do we have a coalition government, which I think is probably the likely outcome, or is the CDU going to try and form a minority government? Now, the SPD has decided probably in their infinite, and I would say wisdom, they want to be in opposition now and have ruled out any grand coalition with Merkel's party. So that means Merkel's got to persuade the Greens and the FDP to come into government. And then she'd obviously have a coalition, because if she gets the Greens and the FDP, she'd then have about 52% of the vote. Therefore, that's sufficient to form a government. But the problem with the Greens and the FDP is not only are their policies not aligned with each other, but they're certainly not aligned with the SDU. So the other option, as was we said, was to try and form this minority government with the CDU supported and propped up by the SPD support. Well, given they've said they want to be in opposition, it's pretty unusual that the major opposition party would be basically supporting the government every time there was a vote in the Reichstag. But the problem is, if they also, there's a belief where if they hadn't formed the major opposition party, the major opposition party then would have been the AfD, which one would have caused major eruptions inside the Reichstag and in German politics. So maybe that's partly why the SPD has decided to form this coalition. So then the broader context is what's actually changed in German politics as a result of this. Well, I think you might see some minor changes internally, but I don't think it. But it's certainly indicative that Merkel's rule is on the wane, and if there is major, geopolitical and financial upheaval which affects Germany, I can't see how Merkel will survive. The government would collapse. So therefore, I think that would be the end of it. Now, the broader question is this going to influence German politics internationally? So the first thing people have said is, well, there's a belief that Merkel may change her viewpoint towards Brexit and allow for compromises in favour of the UK. That's an understanding that we think may be going to happen. Now, the problem is she's going to get bogged down in this whole coalition forming a government. That takes weeks or months. Or in the case of Holland, they still haven't got a coalition government after 6 months, so it can get quite hair-raising. But the belief is the FDP is going to put pressure on Merkel to cut the UK some slack. Why? Because their fear in German business is that if you don't give the UK some slack, they may just go for a hard Brexit. And a hard Brexit could seriously damage German businesses. So they're quite kind of nervous about that possibility. So that might be why Merkel will cut some slack, because it's in her own interest to do so. But no doubt the risk is Germany will still put the integrity of the single market over what may be perceived a short-term hit on the German economy. So it's probably very likely there'll be some weird coalition, which actually may turn out to not really benefit Merkel internally. We may see some political shift in terms of Brexit in the European Union. In a broader context, and we've spoken about this many times, it's the whole German geopolitical shift to the east towards Russia and China. And privately, yes, it's been going on. We've spoken about it many times. We've seen some evidence of it publicly. And at some point, there's going to be a great big push towards that, and that is coming. Is this likely to facilitate that push? Yes, I think it probably is, but not in a particularly overt way. But privately, the weakening of Merkel's position means that it gives more scope to be able to push through the whole ideology of shifting east and moving out of NATO, etc., which is, of course, is going to happen. But that's in a much broader context of something that's going to happen irrespective. But at some point in this event-driven scenario, Germany is very key to that aspect of big changes in Europe. So if it pushes Merkel into a weak position, it may accelerate that process and make it happen quick. So I think that's very, very possible and very likely to happen. But we never expected Merkel to lose. But she has got maybe more than a bloody nose in the process of this happening, and it is likely to affect German policies. I mean, no disrespect to Germany, but most people aren't interested in domestic policies, but certainly internationally, it may well change the perspective somewhat. And there's no doubt there isn't a great appetite for Merkel in Germany, and that she is deeply unpopular. And I suspect that there is a lot of people who didn't vote, who will have, who are deeply opposed to her. And I think she is certainly on the waning and getting considerably weaker in the process. So that must have an influence on the future.
Yes, V.
Yes. Hello, Paul. How are you,
V,
my friend?
I'm very well, and yourself?
I'm hanging in there, my man. I'm on my second Starbucks venti cup of dark roast, and I realized I spent more on coffee today than I would having a monthly membership to the Sirius report. And folks, if you don't have a membership to the Sirius report, getting cutting edge information as to what's going on around the world, especially all the great intelligence and synopses that London Paul will give you, you need to do it. Or you can, I mean, think about it. I just wasted money, and it cost me more to buy these these two venti cups of coffee at Starbucks than it did, um, getting a membership at the Sirius Report. With that being said, London Paul, did you get a chance? Did you and CJ talk about the whole entire satellite imagery that Russia just put out? I don't know if you got a chance to talk about that.
Well, we started initially. I didn't kind of cover too much ground, but what I did say to him is that and this has been the case for quite some time, is that the Russians actually, in the context of Daesh operations, have arrested U.S. special forces and have them in custody.
What? Say that again.
I said that the Russians, in the course of Daesh operations, obviously given the close working relationship they have with U.S. special forces, they do detain and have arrested U.S. special forces. Now, imagine if they produce the mugshots of these people.
Oh my God, they should.
Yeah, that would make satellite imagery of Hummers, etc., to be pretty tame in comparison. But yeah, I mean, we talked about it briefly, but yeah,
that is what is needed for this country, man. For this BS, fighting for democracy and freedom narrative to be finally put to rest and finally put to bed. The best thing that could happen is for Russia to put out these images of U.S. Spec Ops guys arrested while working for USIS.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole basis is, if you think the whole premise since 2001 was we're having a war on terror, well, if it's proved categorically that the US have been aiding the war on terror, I mean, that basically renders 16 years of US foreign policy in the toilet. So
yeah, exactly.
And that would be the most damning indictment and a huge wake-up call for any Americans who aren't aware of what's going on. And for that matter, it's not just Americans, it's British people. You know, people here are as ignorant about the reality of what's gone on in the likes of Libya and Syria and Iraq, because I mean, Britain's got its fingers in these pies as well. And you know, whilst you don't get the same level of coverage, there's no doubt, if you look at Britain's role in all this, it's hardly stands up to scrutiny in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, it's pretty damning. And as I said to CJ, it's indicative that the Russians are running out of patience, and they do. And we've spoken before, they have a lot of intelligence and in their possession. And if the time's right, then they will play their hand, and it can have quite dire, severe sort of consequences in the process. But yeah, we covered that at the start. And then we talked about the German elections, and we talked about Catalonia in some detail. But something worth mentioning, and someone got in touch who's one of our podcast subscribers and mentioned about the whole Russian banks thing and what's been going on, and you know, and is it worth, you know, could we cover it? And I thought, well, I could cover it in a podcast. No, I'll cover it on the show, because yes, we saw only last week that the Russian central bank's has basically bailed out the BNN bank. So the regulator then becomes the main investor in its lender and its affiliates. The one thing the Russian bank's been very clear to emphasize, it's not going to destabilize the national banking sector. And to put this in context, the BNN bank is only ranked as Russia's 12th largest bank with only 25 billion in assets. It's hardly a major bank. Now, a lot of the problem stemmed from the fact that there was a huge sort of capital outflow where around $1 billion equivalent was withdrawn from the bank by individual depositors and companies. Once the bailout was announced, the outflow slowed to an absolute trickle. So yeah, the central bank's taken an equity stake in it. This was on the back of the other major bailout, which was when the central bank, and forgive my pronunciation, I think it's Otkriti, maybe, who that's Russia's largest private bank. Now that bailout process also was instigated for several $billions. Now, this got a lot of people nervous, thinking, okay, this is going to trigger a domino effect in the country's current banking sector. No, it isn't. The important reality is that Russia knows full well what's coming economically, and yes, even in the likes of Russia and China, yes, if the Western banks go down, there are going to be Russian banks that are likely to struggle and could go down. There is also Chinese banks that may struggle and go down. The one difference is they've been preparing for this for a long time. And what they will do is they will save and backstop the banks that may have problems. The banks they don't care about anymore, they've already moved to strip assets. I mean, this is not really China, by the way. I'm just saying as a possibility, but certainly Russia has removed the assets out of banks, and certain banks will just disappear and they don't care and they'll be gone, because that's part of the streamlining process that you'll see in this kind of so-called paradigm shift. And the one big thing that is there's a little history lesson here, that back in 1998 we had the Russian financial crisis, and it resulted in the Russian government and the central bank having to sharply devalue the ruble, and they defaulted on their debt, and the crisis obviously had severe impact on neighboring countries. It also had the positive effect of teaching Russian banks to diversify assets and to solve the kind of economic problems that caused it. Because after all, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a huge debt, and Russia became the only country to not only inherit the foreign property of what was obviously the former USSR, but all of its foreign debts as well. So Russia had to absorb all this. So it was extremely hard for Russia, obviously, to service the debt.
Yeah.
And hence why they restructured it 4 times before the default in 1998. But that was a massive lesson for Russia. They already, in effect, had a financial reset. They got through it, they weathered the storm, and they've learnt the lessons. So they knew for subsequent financial crises that they had a way of weathering the storm. They certainly are doing that, and it's not a major problem with Russian banks. Yes, we've seen 2 banks require a bailout, but it's not a contagion problem, and they're very much dealing with banks on a bank-by-bank basis. And if there are banks in trouble, they will save the ones that are necessary, but certain banks will be sunk. They will no longer function in this sort of paradigm shift, and that's the reality of it. So yes, someone did get in touch saying, it's good to highlight the negative. And yes, to some extent, yes, it certainly is a negative, but they've got it under control, and they've learned the lessons from 1998, certainly learned the lessons from 2008. What's the big difference? They've learned them. What's the West done? Well, they didn't learn anything. They just compounded the problem multifold. So in 2017...
What you don't understand about the West, Paul, is that, unlike the rest of the world, we're playing 5D chess. That's why we didn't, bail out. That's why Wall Street got bailed out. It's all part of the plan, Paul. Because, we realize that the future of the world, a reserve currency, is not the dollar, but it's going to be our new commodity-backed currency that's backed by the commodities of trash, recyclables, and pornography. Did you know that, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely, of course, yeah.
I mean, literally, we have nothing. We have no solutions. You're right. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians are not stupid. They're not like our politicians. I mean, when you look at a cross-section, if I were to take a cross-section of the Chinese politicians and, leaders, and I take a cross-section of the Russian leaders, what you find are people who are heavily educated, highly learned in geostrategic politics, in sciences. They have heavy science backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, backgrounds in biology, medicine. I mean, these guys are brilliant. Then you look at the U.S. and you look at the U.K. You look at much of the West. What do they have? They're all lawyers, Paul. Yeah, they're all lawyers. Every single one of these politicians, they're all lawyers.
Yeah, and the problem is Xi's a great example. To become effectively the Chinese premier, he had to demonstrate all the way through tiers of ranks of leadership that he was capable. And in the end, he was managing, a GDP of $1 trillion+ and 300 million people. And they went, do you know what? You can do that. Now you've earned the right in a meritocratic way to become the Chinese leader. Now, you can talk about one-party state and all the failings of it for sure. But the one thing is, meritocratically, you can come from nothing in China. If you prove your worth, and you can rise right to the top of the Politburo, for want of a better word. And that's precisely what Xi did. Now, in this country and in the US, I have no doubt there is some extremely talented people who could form a government, become prime ministers, become foreign secretary, who will never, in the current structure, ever be afforded that opportunity. So my question is, how meritocratic and democratic is our wonderful two-party state that we all think is, or three parties or five parties, whatever it is, governance? And then we turn to the Chinese for all for the faults that exist. And yes, China's not perfect, far from it, and they have a one-party state, which the West derides. But it seems to me that you have far greater opportunities politically to rise to the top in office than you do, ironically, in the West. And that may shock a lot of people, not people listening to this, but other people. But that's the kind of reality we're dealing with respect to China. And, undoubtedly, Putin didn't become what he was just by chance. He became what he was because he demonstrates the capabilities to rule the nation and to be a genuine leader, not a false leader, which we have in Western nations. And whatever people's criticisms of Trump are, the reality is when he was elected, he was supposed to be able to be a genuine leader. Now, he's not been able to do that precisely because, yes, he's made some howling mistakes. There's no doubt about it. But principally because he was never allowed to, because that's the wonderful democracy that exists in Western nations, which, of course, in time, people throughout the US, the UK, and everywhere else will come to realize the reality of it.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. Absolutely correct. What else is on your radar, Paul?
Right, something interesting. It kind of largely flew under the radar. We talked a lot in the past with when Bannon left office, and there was a lot of consternation that when Bannon left, it was the end of Trump, and Trump was going to be drowned by the swamp in totality. And I said to the contrary, that wasn't the case. And in fact, Bannon leaving was to strengthen his ability to do things. Now, what happens? Steve Bannon flew to Beijing, of all places, for a meeting with the person who you'd arguably say is the second most powerful Chinese Communist Party official, whose name is Wang Qishan, I think it is. He's the head of China's Communist Party and anti-corruption campaign. Now, the question is, what's Bannon doing flying there? Now, this was only a month after he declared that America was at economic war with China. Well, I don't think the Chinese are going to entertain him if that was still his belief and agenda. Now, he also visited Hong Kong and gave this closed-door speech at some big investor conference, which was hosted by what is called the CLSA. Now, it's a Chinese state-owned brokerage and investment group. So here's Bannon previously castigating the Chinese and saying he was at economic war. He's doing a presentation where the Chinese are present in Hong Kong, and then he flies to Beijing for this meeting. Now, by all accounts, the Chinese reached out to Bannon because they wanted to talk to him about economic nationalism and populist movements, in part. And what's interesting is that Wang, who is this highly influential person behind Xi Jinping, he was the one who arranged for this meeting. But he's interestingly stressed that this was no connection whatsoever to Trump's upcoming visit to China. So in essence, the reason they're doing that is to try and divorce the fact that Bannon is in no way affiliated anymore to the Trump administration, as per his resignation or sacking, whichever you want to believe. But the reality is he didn't fly there just to have a general chat about the weather. There's clearly something far more indicative that whilst they're publicly saying he's not representing Trump in any way, shape or form, I don't believe you just have someone going along meeting someone at that high up in the Chinese Communist Party. And incidentally, when he was in Hong Kong, Bannon referred to himself as being Trump's wingman still, which is kind of an interesting reference. And I think the interesting thing is, as well as Bannon's long argued the US needs to take a tougher economic stance against China, because he said, obviously this was responsible for all the manufacturing job loss in the US, and we know the reality of that. there's no doubt he went there for constructive discussions of the Chinese instigation. I see that as a positive signal that China wants to, in some way, shape, or form, try to restore and normalize relations to some extent, despite all the paraphernalia and the shenanigans that's going on in public and with regards to China. There's clearly somebody sees it as an olive branch. Now, I think it comes back to the point I've referred to something in the podcast called Plan B, which was if you can't change things internally within Washington, you'd have to do it externally. Well, this is very much Bannon doing things externally. Bannon's not working on his own. Bannon's very much working for other people who have a vested interest. And it is an uphill struggle, and I'm not suggesting that they will succeed, but there is a definite desire to try and restore some sort of order and normality into Washington, into US politics, and try and effectively rescue the US from total oblivion, which is precisely what we're on course for. And of course, so is Western nations such as the UK. We're not immune in Europe. It's all part of the big, huge paradigm shift. But I think this is an encouraging development to see Bannon go, because let's face it, would you or I, or have you ever seen any other person in Bannon's position being met by the Chinese at that level, at a meeting instigated by the Chinese? No, exactly. So it's something, again, that flies completely under the radar. It's not reported. In fact, in a way, it's good it probably wasn't reported, because the backlash would have been pretty severe. But there's no doubt there's some strong intent from the Chinese to try and weather the storm and change relations. But I think the reality is the people backing Bannon know what's coming. They know in order to drain the swamp, drain the cesspit, whatever you want to call it.
And it is billionaires that are backing Bannon. It is billionaires.
Yes.
By the way.
Yeah, exactly. They're very influential people. They know the US is going to have to be sunk before it can be raised. Mm-hmm. I mean, from the phoenix from the ashes, that is what's going to happen with the cabal. You can't get rid of them and have some hope that you can just tell them to leave, walk away, and everything will be fine. Absolutely
and
not.
I think the release of photos of Americans working closely with ISIS is one of the best things that can happen to kill the deep state. It's one of the best things that can happen.
And that's the point. We also previously said the part of the Plan B would be to instigate some way of starting to attack them from the outside in. Now, I'm not suggesting there's collusion. Dare I say the Russians are colluding to release this information, because they have a separate reason and an agenda. But the byproduct of it is most certainly is that by doing this, it is damaging. It's very damaging for the cabal, deep state, however you want to call it. And there's no doubt it will certainly help to fulfill that process. But it is difficult, but I see certain sort of encouraging signs, pretty low key, that there are attempts being made. But I think the important thing is the huge, and you said financially, wealthy and influential backers who want to save America, who are very pro-American. I'm not some jingoistic, nationalistic nonsense. They actually care deeply about America, like most Americans do, and they want to rebuild and make America a strong nation amongst equals. They want to do that. They're attempting to do it. They're working hard to do it, but they know that the US has to sink to rise again, because there's no other way of doing it. But if you can facilitate ways to try and lessen the impact of that, then that's obviously the most common sense approach to take. And that is what I think the Bannon meeting's partly about, undoubtedly. And we have to see what happens in reality. But there's no doubt he didn't fly there under his own steam and have these conversations. There is definitely an agenda behind it, which is to try and, in a way, restore some sort of normality to relations, because they're so deeply damaged with China on one level, despite the fact China knows the problems that the Trump administration has internally with respect to this. But certainly, we've said before, going around, making such jingoistic and hot air comments with regards to China is utterly ridiculous. Given,
hey, Paul, I just got this hot off the wires right now. I'm still trying to confirm this. This just came in right now, hot off the wires. The U.S. just declared war on Pyongyang.
You joking?
No. It says U.S. declared war. Pyongyang has every right to take action. North Korea foreign minister. Oh, that's what the foreign minister's saying. I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Oh,
Jeez,
okay.
Got me worried for a second.
I
On
was going
another
to
note,
say,
also hot off the wire, Huma Abedin's husband, Anthony the Wiener Schnitzel, has been sentenced to 21 months for sexting.
oh well, we'll just ditch the entire conversation and let's just erase the episode and we'll just focus on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, North Korea, I don't see any evidence that
Yeah, me neither.
the US has any real appetite to start going to war with North Korea. I mean, there's a lot of hot air rhetoric coming out of both sides. There needs to be a reduction in tensions, but I do think Lavrov's comment was quite telling, where he referred to Kim Jong Un and Trump as children playing in the kindergarten. I mean, that's Russia's perspective. It's all just kind of ridiculous, and there's no kind of reality to it. Yes, we can't dismiss there being a threat that North Korea could do something pretty reckless, but I think a lot of it's fear on the behalf of the North Koreans and the US just trying to retain relevancy in terms of their foreign policy and failing rather miserably. And I mean, the rhetoric gets stoked up, then it goes quiet again. Then North Korea sets a missile off, and the whole cycle gets repeated. But yeah, I don't see the likelihood of war happening. I think the likelihood of a war happening was far stronger several months ago, and that may surprise people. I think while the media says tensions are worse than ever, they're not. They're actually not anywhere near as bad as they were. But I don't think we should rest on your laurels and imagine Pyongyang doesn't pose a potential risk of doing something stupid and reckless. But I think it would largely be born out of fear. And the fear isn't whatever we think of their administration, whatever we think of Kim Jong Un. The fear is the Americans will come in and take over and promote regime change and destroy the nation. That's what the mentality of Kim Jong Un is. That's the genuine fear of, and that's why he keeps stoking up, saying, "Well, trying to convince the Americans we have this technology and we can do this." It's to try and ward them off and make them think twice about doing it. But it's a very dodgy kind of premise on which to deal with a nation such as the US. But yeah, I don't see war happening in that sense, and I think there's too many nations who've already basically said that it's just not happening, and therefore I very much doubt we will see that. But we shouldn't make any assumptions about what Pyongyang might do because they feel so like a caged animal and very threatened in the process, and that, as we say, doesn't in any way, shape, or form give any credence to Kim Jong Un's a government dynasty empire, whatever you want to call it, because absolutely not. But we can't just dismiss the threat they feel as being insignificant.
Yeah, exactly. Paul, we're at the end of the broadcast, man. Give out your website and as well as how people could follow you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Yeah, the website's thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. We have the Twitter account at the Sirius Report. We have the Facebook page, which is the Sirius Report. And yes, we do have the premium podcast, which you can access on the website. And it's $4.75 a month. You get the equivalent of 5 podcasts a week, sometimes double podcasts. We don't always do them every day because of other commitments, but you always get 5 a week equivalently. It's very packed information in a very short space of time, 10 to 15 minutes equivalent each podcast. And we think it's great value for money, and we thank everyone who's joined us and supported us, and obviously we thank Rogue Money for doing the shows and raising our profile, because it's very much helped us, and we'll always be very appreciative of that.
Absolutely. With that being said, folks, we are over and out. We'll be back next week, same time, same channel, same station, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Mondays. And you know what time it is? It's time for the Sirius Report. So again, check out Paul and his website over at thesiriusreport.com. Make sure you guys subscribe to his member services, and you can follow us again on roguemoney.net as well as on Twitter at the Rogue Money. That being said, CJ, take it away.